It may not be quite as Jules Verne foresaw it, but there could well be a journey to the centre of the Earth to save our planet in search of the energy of the future, because we are sitting on top of the biggest furnace that we can touch, the planet's geothermal power underneath our feet. Could it help us to ditch fossil fuels? You're watching Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. We are used to digging underground for our energy sources, but with this, there is no oil or gas in sight. Geothermal energy uses the heat of what is underneath the surface of the Earth. And the UK's first such plant has just finished drilling 5 kilometres down. For the latest in our Energy Future series, we are asking if geothermal is a big part of our fuel future.
The world needs new energy sources, and one of them is under our feet. The Earth's heat, geothermal energy. Geothermal is a renewable source that doesn't run out. The heat generated by rocks deep underground heats water to create steam, which powers a turbine. At the Earth's core, 4,000 miles below the surface, temperatures can reach over 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Geothermal energy is available 365 days a year and relatively inexpensive. Direct use can be as much as 80% cheaper than fossil fuels. Geothermal power supplies energy for 25% of Europe's population and is used in countries like Germany, France, Netherlands, and Hungary. A geothermal heat pump takes the available heat from the ground and increases it to a more useful temperature for use in the home. It can reduce energy costs by 30 to 40%. So can geothermal energy help to solve our energy crisis?
So let us get talking. With me at the round table, I have Julian Richardson, founder of the energy and climate risk finance company Parhelion. August Gudmonsen is here, chair of the structural geology department at the Royal Holloway University. From New York in the US, Kathy Hanoun, chief exec of Dandelion Energy, which offers geothermal heating and cooling installations. And from Ireland, we are joined by Riccardo Pasquale, head of geology at the Geothermal Energy company, GT Energy. Well, if you lot don't know anything about this, then nobody does. So I'm going to start by asking you first, August, if I may. This description I read, cold water's pumped down to bring hot water up to power a plant where electrical energy is converted from heat by passing steam through a turbine connected to a generator. Is it as simple as that?
Well, this is one type of geothermal energy and is the one we would use here in the UK if we want to produce electricity. There are 3 basic types of geothermy, or geothermal energy, you would say. The first one is what you have in countries like Iceland, where you have magma, where you have volcanic activity. There you simply have very hot water and steam circulating above a magma body, and you simply drill down there and you get the energy you need in that way. This is only available where you have really active volcanism. So it's a limited source. Then you have what used to be called hot dry rocks or enhanced geothermal systems. This is where you have a hot body, often a granitic body, at depth in the crust. It's very hot, but has very little circulation of water. So it has very little permeability, as we say. For those, we drill a hole down into the body and we inject cold water. This cold water circulates through the body, takes up the heat, and then we take the hot water up to produce either electricity or to produce just space heating. The third one, which can be used everywhere in the world, is what we call heat pumps. Strictly speaking, heat pumps are not geothermy. The heat there is coming from the sun, and it's simply the temperature of the groundwater at a few meters depth. This can be used everywhere in the world, and here in the UK has a great potential, simply for heating in the wintertime and for cooling.
So it is, Julian, it's everywhere, underneath us. And yet I read a figure that said in 2007, correct me if they've been updated, but 2007, only 1/3 of the planet's electricity energy came from these sources.
That's right. It is everywhere, but it's not evenly distributed. So this ground source heat that August was talking about, that is everywhere. But the higher energy, higher enthalpy types of energy, geothermal energy, is not evenly distributed. It's typically found in those high volcanic zones. So the East African Rift Valley is a great example. Turkey, the Pacific Rim of Fire. That's where you get the really high entropy.
Is this because the plates are moving underneath and therefore it's easy to get out the energy from below the surface?
Exactly, and you've got magma upwellings.
And yet we have, don't we, this drill that's gone down 5 kilometres in Cornwall. I've read about other ones in Germany, helping to fuel the city of Munich. And I read about people in Norway who want to go down to 10,000 metres, which it says multiplies by a factor of 10 the amount of energy you can extract from such an arrangement. The deeper you go, the hotter it gets.
Yes, but it's not a simple straight line calculation. You don't need to go that deep in places like East Africa and Turkey. You only need to go maybe 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 metres, and you can get into really very high temperature resources that can produce electricity and power. But if you're in a lower enthalpy area, lower energy...
When you say enthalpy, you mean energy efficient in terms of geothermal?
Yes,
in other words, let's say you get 90% out, rather than losing 90% in getting it out.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
OK, let's talk about the technology. Kathy, you may want to come in on this one. Ricardo also. To go down to, let's say, 10,000 metres, where it is, 374 degrees centigrade, 220 atmospheric pressures. You can get the steam, the water pushed up at incredible pressures to the surface of the Earth. Ricardo, this one may well be for you. How difficult is it technologically to do this?
Well, it depends really what type of depths you're looking at drilling. So in terms of, for example, take geothermal heat plants. Typically, you try to achieve temperatures of about 95 to 100 or 120 degrees for those to provide space heating and cooling to some extent, or industrial process heat. And that's much more readily available, let's say, at shallower depths. So we're talking perhaps somewhere around the 3,000 to 4,500 metre range. This can all be achieved using standard oil and gas drilling technology, which we have today and we've used, for decades to explore and complete hydrocarbon boreholes. So the actual drilling part of that is readily available. The challenge really is in trying to understand and achieve those depths based on the knowledge and information that we have for certain areas.
OK. I'm going to go to Kathy now, but you all know you can chip in any time you want. So you can go down to these depths, and another one of the things that I read is that, OK, you may exhaust what's there in 20 to 30 years. You let it cool down, fill up again, and 20 to 30 years down the line, you can use it all over again.
Well, actually, the company that I run specializes in heat pumps for residential homes. So you can imagine we're going to much shallower depths just to capture that stored sunlight that was talked about earlier. And for that, the drilling technology we're really working on is making the technology smaller and much gentler, because as you can imagine, homeowners aren't thrilled when heavy-duty drilling equipment destroys their yard. So we're only going about 100 meters down. And our challenge is, how do we make that process as gentle as possible? But to your question about the lifetime of geothermal wells, I do think it depends on the type of geothermal we're talking about. In the heat pump case, we design those boreholes so that they last forever. They should literally last longer than the home itself. So once a homeowner decides to put them in, if they've been well designed, they should never have to worry about them again.
Kathy, how do you know that somebody's home is the right place for it without drilling?
Yeah, so one of the great features of this more shallow heat pump type of geothermal is it's essentially available everywhere. So as long as your home is sitting on the ground, which most are, and the yard is large enough to accommodate a small drill, it should be technically suitable to put these geothermal wells into that yard.
Okay, so I get you to come and drill in my back garden, go down 100 metres. I've got electricity for life. How much does that cost me? When do I start saving money?
So one quick clarification is that these wells actually do not produce electricity because the heat is much less hot than you would get going down thousands of meters. You're actually just extracting heat that can be used for heating and cooling. So it's thermal energy rather than electrical energy. But to answer your question about cost, right now in New York, we have one option where homeowners can pay over time. So they pay nothing to get the system installed, and then it costs them about $135 per month. And then for customers that decide to purchase up front, the net cost is around $18,000.
So it's manageable, and it provides effectively the hot water. Now, I want to talk about what's underneath there, if I may, with you experts for just a moment. We go down into underneath the surface of the Earth. There is potassium-40, there's uranium-238, there's uranium-235, there's thorium-232. These are all radioactive materials. How, and this is, some of the heat comes from the decaying of the radioactive materials. How do you make sure that it doesn't get into the supplies?
There are radioactive elements really everywhere.
That's
but they are
part
not
of
just
background radiation.
It is as simple as that. It's not something you need to
nothing
think
to
about.
Be worried. No, nothing to be worried about. It's everywhere.
Sorry, Ricardo. Yeah.
I think it's also important to point out, particularly for low to medium enthalpy type of systems like you would see in the UK or in many parts of Europe, the fluids that you bring from geothermal wells to the surface are generally passed through a heat exchange process, through a heat exchanger. So the heat is extracted and that fluid goes back down into the re-injection well. So effectively, anything that comes out of the ground goes back into the ground. So that significantly minimizes that issue that you raised beforehand.
Kathy, I suppose one of the beauties of this is that it's always on. It's not weather dependent.
That's right. You can just harvest the heat that just already exists underneath the property you already own instead of having to worry about weather dependence or, the ever-changing prices of fuels that people use for heating.
August, you were nodding at that. There's something you want to add?
When I make a little bit propaganda for this in both for my students and so on, I emphasize this point that Kathy was saying here. Namely, if we look at renewables, we have solar energy, we have wind energy, both we have in the UK, and those, of course, are not steady. Therefore, the beauty of it, or combining it with geothermy, is very great because geothermy is steady. It is there day and night, doesn't depend on anything. It is always there. And it applies both to the electricity production, when we are talking about hot, dry rocks going down to the 3-4 kilometers depth, and to the shallow heat pump production that we can find anywhere. So it's steady. The energy is always there, and therefore this mix is so good to combine solar, wind, and geothermal.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet in the energy solution, but geothermal plays a really important part, not least because it has this, what they call base load, so it is always on, and that's really important for balancing the grid and giving reliable and consistent supply. But geothermal power production also has very low levelized cost, so the cost over the period of the production and development stage is one of the cheapest of all the energy sources out there.
So once you've found it, once you've gone down and got it?
Once all that has been worked together, it is actually one of the cheapest forms of electricity there is. And it's also one of the cleanest because, as we were saying, what you're taking out, you also put straight back into the ground. So there are very few emissions associated with it. So on a
is it just the difficulties that we've encountered so far that means that it's taken us this long to get to the point where it is still relatively underused, when in fact it sounds from everything you're saying like it should be something that we're concentrating on.
It should be, definitely. It's not. It has some challenges in developing the resource because you can't, you really have to spend quite a lot of money for the high enthalpy resource. It's not the sort of ground source that Kathy refers to. But if you want to put a 100 megawatt power plant up, you're going to have to spend quite a lot of money.
Just to remind us, 100 megawatt would power
6,000 houses plus. That's
so
quite a significant.
Be quite big.
Yeah. So we're looking at you have to spend quite a lot of money doing surface studies, getting geologists and geophysicists and geochemists to understand what the geology looks like, and that's even before you go below the surface. And it's only once you go below the surface do you really know the value of that resource. And you have to drill multiple wells to significant depth. And that is quite risky and expensive. So actually one of the biggest difficulties of geothermal energy, power production, is the financing of it.
Well, see, this is where we get. We've been talking on this programme about different forms of energy. We've been talking about solar panels. We've been talking about nuclear fusion. Let me bring nuclear fission into this, a nuclear power plant as such. How does what you've just described with the upfront costs, not necessarily the running costs, compare? Does anybody want to throw this in with building a nuclear power plant?
It's a fraction. It's
so we're
probably
not
a hundredth of a nuclear plant.
And maybe I should add here, because I've been involved in that a little bit. The main problem with fission, not fusion, which we have never reached, fission, which is the standard of nuclear power plants today everywhere, is we don't know what to do with the waste. The waste in UK is...
So there are two extreme costs, aren't there?
Yes. We haven't solved that problem. No one has solved the problem where to put the waste.
Ricardo's dying to say something.
No, I just wanted to just point out that I think it's really important to consider geothermal within the context of what it is that you want to use the energy for. So, for example, for power generation, yes, projects are more complex, and the requirements, let's say, from the subsurface are more complex and certainly more costly to achieve. But you also have to look at heating. And the majority, over 40% of the UK's heat demand is currently met by fossil fuels. And we know from decades of onshore hydrocarbon exploration and from recent studies, for example, only in a very limited section of the subsurface across the UK that there is a potential of about 4,000 megawatts thermal of heat available in areas in the UK. And that's excluding some key sites like where we're working, for example, in Stoke-on-Trent or in Manchester, which weren't even considered as part of that study. So there is a massive, let's say, lower risk heat resource matched to a high heat demand area, which needs to be considered in the context of this conversation.
Kathy, and then I'll come back to the science, if I may, in just a moment. But Kathy, and you can answer this one if you feel inclined as well. When it comes to the energy sources of the future, could there be a time, you think, when geothermal, because of the costs that have been covered, because of the simplicity that come with advances, could be the major energy source that we use on this planet?
I think for sure for heating and cooling in buildings, heat pumps will be the technology that's used in the future. I don't think we can imagine a future where fuel oil or heating oil delivery trucks continue to put heating oil in people's homes, or even natural gas, has risks of carbon monoxide or explosions. And I think we'll look back and it will seem rather antiquated. So I think the world is headed towards a heat pump future. And because of the reasons the other guests have suggested, I think base load needs will become increasingly critical. And geothermal will have a really important role to play in that baseline foundation for our renewable power systems.
So when Kathy's talking about baseline, she's talking about general power usage as opposed to just heating homes and cooling homes?
It's that base load. It's that always-on bit, because energy demand fluctuates. When everyone watches their favourite soap opera and it finishes, the peak comes in. So you need to service the peak. But there's always a base load of demand. And that's the bit that geothermal is good at supplying in power production.
But could it, do you think, overtake all of the other energy sources that we've talked about as possible
in certain
saviours of the future?
In certain parts of the world. So in those volcanistic areas, it could easily supply 100% of the energy demand in, say, the East Africa Rift Valley, or
Could that then be transported into a grid where it could be used in the UK, where it could be used in other parts of North
Africa? I
Africa?
think we're looking at lower energy resources, and that's those sort of low or mid enthalpy type projects that.
But if you took the energy from the Rift Valley,
yes,
and transported it through a grid to another part of the world, where it wasn't so cost-effective produce it.
Yeah.
Could it be used there?
Do you know what? I don't know. You'll have to, someone else will have to comment on the power losses, but they're also talking about putting, 1% of the Sahara covered in solar panels could also power the entire amount of Europe. So, those both are sources that could contribute, but actually the biggest challenges there are political and... And
Kathy, I did say you could interrupt. Please go ahead.
I would just say that I think transporting geothermal energy in some form is already done, in the sense that in countries like Iceland, for example, that have very inexpensive geothermal resources, you tend to find a lot of industry like aluminum manufacturing, which is very energy intensive, and then that material can be exported to other countries where energy is more expensive. So while you're not connecting that geothermal energy to a grid, because that would have high losses to transport it over great distances, you're essentially transporting that energy in the form of a very high energy material. And I think we could see a lot more of that in countries that have cheap geothermal power.
August, you're the geologist sitting here. You know about the objections to fracking for gas and that form of energy. Some people think it causes tremors in the earth, that it dislocates bits of the ground underneath their feet. Is there any downside to this? Like if 6 billion people were relying on holes drilled in the ground?
Well, when we make geothermal energy, we do it in two ways. If you're dealing with a hot, dry rock, we can use the standard hydrofracking, then we make a new fracture, and you get considerable earthquakes. If we do it in the way we call hydrosharing, where you use the existing fractures, then the earthquakes are usually much smaller. But normally, just before
you can't avoid earthquakes.
No, if you increase the fluid pressure in the Earth's crust, you will always generate earthquakes. But 99% of them are below magnitude 2, so you wouldn't notice them. They're similar to maybe a car driving outside your house on a road that's far away. So I think that...
On the other hand, if you've got 4,000 of these every minute, because it's happening all of the time...
But that's the point. That wouldn't happen with geothermal. No. When they're fracking to get shale gas out, they're fracking lots of different places, multiple locations, and consistently. Ideal geothermal resources don't need fracking at all. It really depends on the fluid and thermodynamics, the movement of the heat and the steam through the rocks. In enhanced geothermal systems, there is fracking. But that is, that's not a constant thing. It happens once, and the fractures are created or the shears are created, and it just then relies on the constant circulation of the fluid and the heat around the resource.
Ricardo, let me ask you this one, and everybody can just say yes or no, or nominate if you like. Out of solar panels, wind power, nuclear fusion, which we've talked about capturing human energy. Where does geothermal stand on the list as a potential saviour of the human race when it comes to its energy demands of the future?
Are you asking me where does it stand today? Or
no, where could it stand? Okay, let's say that.
Well, it's the heat beneath your feet, so it should stand quite high in our priorities in terms of harnessing it. As we've said before, there are massive opportunities in terms of heating and cooling from resources that we know are there, and there are.
But does it trump all the others?
Well, it's different. The base load aspect of geothermal is really what one wants to achieve. So you want to have a constant, always on, type of energy
Yeah.
source that you can rely on. And none of those other renewables, unfortunately, can do that unless you go down the nuclear fission route or whatever. But that's a sort of slightly different scale as well, I think. And more importantly, you want to consider security of supply. So geothermal is something local. It's something that's produced and generally used where you find it, and it doesn't depend on other fuel sources.
Do you know what that was, Ricardo? That was sort of on the one hand this, or on the other hand that. It was not the answer of yes.
You want a
it's going to be
one-handed
number one.
economist, right?
Look, we've got to
Yes.
wrap up in just a moment. Could it be number one?
Yes, it could in certain parts of the world.
Fantastic. Listen, thank you. Half an hour just shoots by. Thank you very much indeed. August, Kathy, Ricardo, thank you for being part of it. Julian, you too. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you've learned something from our series. I've certainly been fascinated sitting here talking to people who really know what they are on about, and when it comes to energy needs of this planet in the future, well, we know that we all need some answers. I hope you've got some. From me, David Foster, from the team, thank you for watching this roundtable. We'll be back next time and hope you will be too. Goodbye for now.